Welcome to The Record. I'm Mark Maxwell. Illinois will soon become the first state in the nation to abolish cash bail. The Illinois Supreme Court just this week upheld the end of a money bond in a 5-2 court ruling released Tuesday. That 43-page decision found judges have tools other than money to guarantee a criminal defendant shows up for their day in court. Now, jails, courts, and prosecutors have 60 days to prepare to unwind that old system that has lasted nearly a century. Those preparations for the transition have been underway for a few years now, and the new law itself has also been written and rewritten several times to include updates along the way. Intense debate around this subject has divided public officials, police, and prosecutors alike. We have two guests on The Record today to discuss the impact and implementation of this dramatic shift in the justice system in the land of Lincoln. Both of these guests with extensive backgrounds in law enforcement. State Senator Terry Bryant will join us in just a moment. But first, we sat down with former Illinois State Trooper Marie Franklin, who spent a dozen years working in law enforcement and came away with the view that a system designed to protect victims all too often creates them. A lower court initially ruled that the Safety Act was unconstitutional. What was your reaction when the Illinois State Supreme Court overruled that and allowed this policy to take effect?
Oh, I was ecstatic. I have worked in criminal justice. I am now an advocate to reform criminal justice. And I was ecstatic that we were finally looking at things in a different way. And, you know, in this country, you're supposed to be innocent until proven guilty. And having a cash bail system was not following that practice.
The presumption of innocence, or the benefit of the doubt, is certainly a noble position. It says we're going to wait and let this be played out in the courts. But when a crime has occurred and a victim has been victimized, somebody is dangerous in that equation, whether they're still not yet proven to be innocent or
but
guilty.
if you look at the statistics and the 250,000 people who are incarcerated pre-trial, most of their the crimes are not what you would term violent. They're drug related, they're mental issue related, and the only reason that they are incarcerated is because they don't have money to get out. So if you got a quote unquote dangerous person, if they've got enough cash, you know, they're out.
You're driving to the heart of this, which I think tries to draw a red line between violent crime and property crime or other nuisance crimes that aren't necessarily born of malintent. And that would say you can no longer buy your way out. Do you think that the Democrats who are advocating for this policy change lost control of the messaging somewhere? Because it really seemed like during the political season that a lot of the critics of this law were able to say it's going to be the biggest jailbreak ever.
You know, I don't know. I don't think that we lost control. I'm say we. You know, I'm considered a Democrat, and I'm an advocate for this law. I don't think we lost control of the messaging. I just think that there were people who took advantage of regular citizen not being up on what the law actually stated and using that to create fear to keep this system in place. Some people just don't like change. But you know, we require change here. The criminal justice system has, to some folks, in a particular group of folks, black and brown and poor people, done more harm than good. And we must do something to correct that. We cannot keep going in that system where we have people, you know, over 250,000 folks a year are incarcerated pre-trial.
In Illinois?
That means in Illinois, yes, and that means that they haven't been convicted of anything. It's just an accusation.
And how many of those are violent crimes, do you know?
You know, and I think percentage-wise, and don't quote me, I'm not quite sure about it, but I think, you know, less than 20% are considered violent, you know, murders and that kind of thing. And, you know, and I'm being generous there. I don't think it's that much. And so with the system that is coming, thank God, there is going to be a robust hearing to determine if this person is a danger to someone or is a flight risk. That was supposed to be the purpose of bail, in the first place, to make sure this person shows up to court and make sure this person is not a danger to someone. But somehow it got turned into this, oh, this is how the county makes their money. And it got turned into this cash system, and it's just unfair. And then we just have to acknowledge that it was unfair, and it was unfair to Black and brown and poor people, and we have to do something about that.
And just for a bit of factual context or historical context, you said how it was first intended. Sometimes we see something in practice and we assume it's always been this way. Abraham Lincoln never knew what bail was. It wasn't around back then. In the early 1900s was when this became a practice in the first place. But I want to shift gears to your personal experience, because in politics there's always a message, but messengers are interesting, right? You can speak from your vantage point different than maybe a politician would. You were an Illinois state trooper for more than a decade. I wonder how often you saw someone arrested, jailed, later proven not guilty in a court of law.
There's one particular incident that comes to mind. I did a traffic stop on a person that was speeding, and he had a warrant out in another county because he didn't return a blockbuster movie. And I had to arrest him.
What happened to him?
My hands were tied. He had his child in the car. He had to call someone to come get his kid, or, social services were going to have to step in. He didn't have the money to pay the bond, and so he had to sit in jail and wait for the county to come and pick him up.
And what was your jurisdiction or territory?
I was here in this area in District 11 in St. Clair County.
So St. Clair County. Mm-hmm. And what have you heard about the current conditions of the St. Clair County Jail?
I'm sure that, like most jails, are probably overcrowded. I do know that Sheriff Rick Watson does try to do the best he can to treat people fairly. It's not about a particular jail, it's about the system. And it's about, being able to implement this thing and implement this into the system to make the system fair. Right now the system is not fair. It's based on how much money you have, and, we all know that that's just not fair to people.
You mentioned earlier in this interview that some people just don't like change. And I think some people in our audience might be hesitant or reluctant to say, oh, this feels like a good idea, because it is different. Yes. And when you talk about crime and danger, people tune in and they go, wait a minute, what does this mean for me? You alluded to this moral earlier in the story about the Blockbuster DVD incident. But I wonder, some folks may be arrested, jailed, and later proven guilty, but perhaps not of a violent crime, maybe a property crime or a nuisance crime. Why should those folks, on a moral level, why should they get out of jail before their day in court?
Well, because first of all, we are a country that is based on you're innocent until proven guilty.
But there's been a preponderance of evidence. There's been, a police officer has seen, okay, this looks like a crime has been committed here.
Yes, but we still must, the rule of thumb is, or my value is, it is better to release one guilty person than to incarcerate 50 non-guilties. So you give people a chance to be out and be involved in their own defense. If you're incarcerated pre-trial, you can't even participate in your own defense. You have to depend on someone else, or your family is devastated by trying to figure out, okay, do we pay rent or do we get out dad? Mm-hmm. So those things are just not fair, and in this system that has been proven to be devastating to Black and brown communities. One night of a 24-hour jail for someone can, wreck their whole system. Their car gets towed, their job gets lost, their kids get taken away. And that's just not the way that we should, that is not a way to keep communities safe. Matter of fact, that is a way that devastates communities. So we need to make sure that what we are doing is what we say we're doing, that we are keeping communities safe, and communities for everybody, not just for a select few.
It sounds like you're speaking to the practical and economic realities of the disruption of being arrested and jailed,
Yes.
even before that criminal conviction, should it come. My last question to you is this, because we do want to get to Senator Terry Bryant, but I wonder if 1 year from now, or 1 year after the 60 days from now when this is implemented, if we look back and we see there's a significant drop-off in the number of suspects and defendants who were supposed to appear in court but didn't. If we see, because sufficient surety is the word the Constitution uses.
Yes.
It says we need to have a surety, we need to have a guarantee that this defendant is going to come and actually show up in court. But without that bond there, if we see a significant decline in people actually making their court date, will that be time to say maybe some of this was a mistake?
No, and because, studies have shown Cook County is already doing this. And they have already shown that if you want people to show up in court, bond is not the way to do it. A simple text message, gets people, just a simple reminder, gets people in court.
But that's a scary moment. Some people might be saying, I'm going to court and I'm about to lose my liberty for a while, right? If they're convicted.
Yes.
There's motive not to show up.
But there's also motive to show up, and for some people, it's just to get the thing done. Because if you don't show up, and there are ways to, if people don't show up for court, there are consequences for that. They get a warrant, but you don't want to put a heavy burden on somebody who doesn't show up for traffic court and they got a warrant with money they can't pay.
So let me ask the question a different way. How will you know a year from now that this program is working?
So a part of the Safety Act and part of the Pretrial Fairness Act says that the counties and the state must take data, record data of
Measure
what's
it.
happening with people and measure what's going on. So we should be able from that data, because I don't think prior to this they were told they had to do it. I think with this, with the Safety Act and the Pretrial Fairness Act, they are obligated to collect data. And so that way, in a year from now, you can look at the data and see. But with, the federal system doesn't use cash bond. The juvenile system doesn't use cash bond. And Cook County has been doing this for over a year now. Prior to it being implemented, they've already said we're going to just get a head start on this and do it now. And, numbers have shown that a simple text message, people show up.
Well, Marie Franklin, a fascinating conversation. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me.
Senator Bryant worked at the Illinois Department of Corrections for 2 decades in 2 different state prisons, starting that career back in 1994. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
Let's start with the moral aim of the justice system. Do you believe that all Americans are innocent until proven guilty?
I do, I think some questions maybe as we talk are going to come up about whether someone should be locked up when they haven't been proven guilty yet. I think there needs to be a full review about whether someone should be locked up when they're innocent, they're innocent before proven guilty. But I think as we talk about the Safety Act, one of the things that we need to be looking at is, did we need to reform our bail system? Or did we need to throw it completely out, which is what the Safety Act does?
It throws it out, but it replaces it with something, too. We'll get into some of those details. Another moral question about the criminal justice system. Do you see evidence in your years looking at the justice system that poverty played a role in crime?
Well, of course. That kind of goes without saying. If you are in a more affluent area, you're going to have more opportunities available to you. If you are living in a more economically depressed area, then of course you might do some things that you wouldn't if more resources were available to you.
So those reforms that you just said should happen, should they take that poverty or wealth factor into account?
Perhaps. I think in regard to the Safety Act and this, one of the tools that we have at our disposal in the system that we have, even if we reform it, is judicial discretion. So, in fact, a judge can look at a person's ability to bond out, or the ability to look at what has that person's life been like as a whole. Did they have the opportunities? If given certain, maybe they have some counseling done, or they have some things available to them now, would they be a risk to society? Unfortunately, I think with the Safety Act, we've taken out a lot of the measures of judicial discretion that were there, and we've completely taken that aspect away from a judge.
Well, a judge will still have discretion to keep someone in jail and refuse or deny their chance to buy their way out if they're accused of violent crimes, of hurting someone. Do you see benefit to that aspect of this?
Well, I do if you take it by the strictest sense of that particular crime. But a judge, when the judge is able to look at something as a whole, you could have a circumstance where maybe all someone did was trespass around someone's property, let's say. But if that person happens to be an individual who has been someone who was a domestic abuser, and this is their next means to put some fear into the person that that they're trying to abuse. Maybe if you're looking at it and say, well, this trespass is not that big a deal, but if you look at it as the whole, then yeah, it's progressive. So the next step for this person would be this. So a judge would have the opportunity to look at that and say, I'm going to keep this person locked up because their past behavior has indicated to me that the next thing they're going to do is something more violent.
And a couple points of fact, you raised a couple of scenarios there. Matters of trespassing, the Supreme Court said a police officer can not only cite that person, but physically remove them from the location. And aggravated stalking is one of those reasons for a domestic violence suspect or defendant or someone who has priors. The courts can also take that into consideration. In fact, that's why domestic violence advocacy groups supported these changes, because those people would be not able to bond out and go right back to that situation. They'd be held.
So you mentioned, like in the lead up to this, you used the word that update, I think, in regard to the Safety Act, that there have been, we call them trailer bills, right? Some trailer bills.
It's kind of like insider
to come
jargon,
behind.
yeah.
And I would say to your question and to the update, in regard to update, this is probably going to be something that's going to be updated over and over again. But those updates are things that were brought up in debate on the House and the Senate floor when the original Safety Act was brought up. Had the formers of this bill, had the people who put this bill together, listened to law enforcement, listened to state's attorneys, and not just the one or two that they cherry picked, had they listened to them and really put some meat into this act, we wouldn't need all of these trailer bills. I think the prior speaker talked about data and looking at data a year from now. Well, that data that we're going to be looking at is whether or not someone reoffended. I would hate to be the person who was the victim of a violent crime because someone was allowed to be out, and I'm now I'm a source of data instead of having that person locked up and and not able to get to me.
You mentioned the trailer bills or the updates, the revisions to this law. The version of the bill that exists in law now, better or worse than the initial version?
Oh, it's better than the initial version, but there are...
Because?
Well, I mean, so because we made some changes to, clarified or made changes to trespass. We made a change. One of the things, you mentioned that I worked at 2 institutions. There were 2 others that were kind of satellites. My early career, I was at Work Release, where you also had electronic detention monitoring. The original bill said that a person could be gone for 48 hours and, basically nothing was going to happen to them, right?
They'd be off the radar, so to
Right,
speak.
they'd be totally off the radar. I think we added some language that said that they could, you only would charge them with an escape if the person's intention was to escape, right? But in my experience in corrections, I could see a guy falling down on the ground when the police show up and said, well, I got a little drunk, and so I know I'm in Missouri, but I was drunk or I was high or whatever the circumstance happens to be. They're not going to say that they tried to escape. So we made some improvements in regard to electronic monitoring and so forth. So there were some improvements, but there's a whole lot of more improvements. And, Mark, I'm sure you're probably going to ask some questions about this, but I think my biggest concern right now, because my district is a Southern Illinois district where it's not a wealthy district from Missouri to Indiana. So I cover the span of the entire state. And I just left a town hall a little bit earlier this morning where we talked about Randolph County, which is, a portion of that is part of the metro, kind of the Metro East. They're looking at fines and fees that they will no longer be able to collect, because those are also gone with the Safety Act, about 90% of that, to the tune of about $320,000. For a non-affluent county, $320,000 is a lot of money. That's money that won't go to counseling, won't go to domestic violence programs, and it has to be recouped. So what happens? Property taxes have to be increased. On the Illinois side, that's a big deal for property taxes to be increased.
I think advocates have long said that that operation of government, those programs that you just said, shouldn't be underwritten by the backs of people who are innocent yet not proven guilty.
And I totally get that. And so all along, the legislature has said, we'll make up those fees,
And they
right?
haven't
And
done
those
it
fines.
yet.
They haven't done it.
So is that are you outlining an update to come?
I'm
funding?
saying you can't have one. So Illinois is remarkably good at doing everything backwards, right? So you create a mandate of some sort and then figure out how you're going to fund it. It would be much better if we said, oh, we've created the funding for
Ready,
this, and
fire,
now we're going to make this. Yeah, it's being reactive to everything instead of being out in front of it.
I want to ask you some of the same benchmark questions so we can put down some goals and say a year from now, 2 years from now. Do you anticipate more people will miss their court dates without that bond?
I do, and especially along the border counties. So again, remember, I have Missouri and Indiana in my district. There was an article a while back, I think it was from New Jersey, I'm not sure, about an officer who arrested a guy at the beginning of his 12-hour shift and arrested the same guy 7 times during that day. When you're in a border county,
You'll have those problem suspects from time to time.
sure. So yeah, so that might be an outlier, maybe. But in the Metro East and going south from there, if someone steals a car and they get arrested and they bond out that day, they're going to cross the river and go into Missouri. Now maybe you're going to get that person back, but now you have to go through all of the process of bringing them back over from Missouri into Illinois or Indiana into Illinois.
I want to get your response to one other quick question from some of the House Republicans that are in and around your part of Southern Illinois. They argue that the Constitution, the state Constitution says, quote, all persons shall be bailable by sufficient sureties. And they said that word shall doesn't have any wiggle room in it. Certainly it doesn't. But judges today can already say a sufficient surety is $0 and you're going to face a consequence if you miss your court date. That's a sufficient
on your own
surety,
recognizance.
right? So can't it be also true that bond set at $0 plus these other consequences are a sufficient surety?
If you allowed the judge to continue to have discretion, but much of the Safety Act takes that discretion away from the judges. So where the judge could look at it and say, you're a pretty good guy, I think you're going to make it back, you've got a lot of family, you've got ties here to the community, a lot of those resources and that discretion is taken away from them.
We look forward to continuing this conversation for the 2 months to come until it takes place. Thanks for joining us. Before we go, I got to rope you into a political question here.
right.
Darren Bailey or Mike Bost?
I'm going to hold off for just a little while in endorsing anyone.
What are you looking for in a candidate?
So I'm looking for, I never endorse someone running against an incumbent that's doing their job.
Is Mike Bost doing his job?
Mike Bost does his job.
There we go. Might you endorse Mike Bost?
I did not.
But you might.
I might.
Very interesting.
Yeah.
State Senator Terry Bryant, thank you for joining us. To you joining us from home or wherever you're at, we hope you have a great week. We'll see you at this same time next week. Until then, we're off the record.